in popular culture. Much of it's innocuous, you think it's neutral, but almost every story, even TV shows, have assumptions about what's possible for human beings, what constitutes happiness, what constitutes success, what constitutes failure. It's also really important when you're watching a show to ask, what is the perspective of this show on what we ought to laugh at and what we're not allowed to laugh at, right? Where is it trying to move us in terms of what we think is funny and what we're not willing to laugh at? In 1999, and I want to play a clip, I want to give some background for this first, the film The Cider House Rules, which Planned Parenthood celebrated, and it was celebrated at the Oscars by Planned Parenthood. Michael Caine, famous actor, won a Best Supporting Actor award for his role as someone in New England who both runs an orphanage and an abortion clinic simultaneously. It's one of Tobey Maguire, better known for Spider-Man and lots of other things. He's an orphan who is sort of a medical apprentice to this doctor, and he's learned the trade of medicine. And the question is whether the Tobey Maguire character will grow up to replace the Michael Caine character in every respect, including performing abortions. So notice how it's set up. The guy who's performing the abortions is presented initially very sympathetically because he's a very generous man who takes care of orphans. Adjacent to the orphanage is an apple orchard, a cider house, right? This is where the title comes from, The Cider House Rules. And in the cider house live mainly African-American workers who have not had an education. There are rules on the wall of the cider house. And in the scene that we're going to play here, the Tobey Maguire character, they ask him to read the rules on the wall of the cider house. You will see a young woman lying in a bed who is pregnant. She's been impregnated by her father, who will be the dominant speaker in this scene. The rules are a stand-in for the traditional prohibitions against abortion. So let's roll this clip.
This is the last one. There should be no going up on the roof at night.
Now, why don't they just say, don't go up on the roof?
That's it.
That's it.
That don't mean nothing at all. And all this time I've been wondering about them.
They're outrageous, them rules.
Who live in this side of the house? Who grinding up those apples? Person that side of cleaning up all this mess? Who just plain live here, just breathing in that vinegar? Well, someone who don't live here made those rules. These rules ain't for us. We the ones supposed to make our own rules. And we do. Every single day. Ain't that right, Homer?
That's right.
Well, why don't you burn them rules in the stove?
Go ahead, Homer, do it.
So there's a kind of standard familiar element in the way the rules are talked about, right? Which is, we didn't make the rules, somebody else made the rules and they're being imposed upon us, right? This is sort of a common refrain about the laws against abortion being framed exclusively by men who are not involved in the circumstances that women find themselves in. And you do have here a case of pregnancy by incest, which would be, in the traditional argument in favor of abortion, one of those necessary evil cases, according to that side, right? But notice the rules, we only played the very end of the rules. So the rules are a set of rules that could be summed up, as one of the characters just said, as don't go on the roof. So it's don't smoke on the roof, don't sleep on the roof. It's 4 or 5 rules about not going onto the roof, right? Notice the character of the rules, though. This could have been treated as a tragically necessary case, and Tobey Maguire does go on to begin performing abortions to take the place of his mentor, because he's torn in his conscience and then sees, according to him, that this is the right thing for him to do. Notice the character of the rules, though. One of the reasons they're scoffing at the rules is that the rules are redundant and the rules are about something completely trivial. Don't go on the roof, right? These are not rules about significant matters. And so the prohibition against harming unborn innocent life is being equated to a rule that says, don't go on the roof, right? What's going on there? What's going on is the trivialization of the prohibition against abortion, right? It's trivializing it. So in the theater, when I saw this, when it came out, and I reviewed it, and I think you've got some links to some reviews I've done to some of these films that I'm going to be talking about. In the theater, the next scene is an abortion. The immediately following scene is of all the workers in the cider house standing on the roof. And in the theater, when I saw that, everybody in the theater, almost everybody, laughed. Right? That scene of them standing on the roof is not in the DVD. It was cut. But it was in the original theater cut, indicating what? And it was intentionally, the filmmakers got out of the audience what they wanted, which was the audience laughing at the workers protesting these stupid rules about being on the roof. But remember, those rules are equated as being at the same level of seriousness with the rules against abortion. So what are we implicitly being taught to laugh at? Not just the stupidity of the people who made the rules for the cider house, but the stupidity of the rules against abortion. It's not so much an argument against abortion as it is trying to train our response so that we mock it or laugh at it, right? There's a great set of a storyline in a Seinfeld episode, which is about making pizza. It's also about an uproar in a restaurant about abortion, and they get into a fight at the end about when does a pizza become a pizza, right? In the Seinfeld episode. Now, what's going on there, I think, it's a little bit different. It's not so much mocking the prohibition against abortion, because people get into a big fight over this, as it is saying we don't really have rational debates about abortion in our culture. But what's going on in the cider house is actually trying to train the audience to laugh at prohibitions against abortion. If you want to take this to its logical term, and maybe even one step beyond that, and I'm not going to show a clip from this film because there's almost no scene that doesn't contain either offensive action or certainly language. But there's a film in 2014 called Obvious Child, which the critics loved. It didn't do that well at the theater. And it's a kind of young woman who's down and out on her luck, who's a stand-up comic, not very successful. She drinks way too much one night and becomes pregnant. When she talks to her mother about this important thing that she has to talk about, namely that she's pregnant and has decided she's going to have an abortion. Her mom says, "Oh, thank God. I thought you were going to tell me that you were moving to LA." In a subsequent scene, after she's arranged to have the abortion on Valentine's Day, she's doing stand-up the night before, and her friend says to her, she's nervous about the stand-up, her friend says to her, you're gonna kill it out there. Get this line. She says, "No, I'm doing that tomorrow." This is in a line of dialogue in a film that was praised almost universally by critics. And then, on a Valentine's Day date, she goes with her boyfriend to the abortion clinic. We're already right there to shout your abortion, right? That we will make fun of this and we will simply defy, not argue, just defy anyone who opposes the right to abortion. And it goes one step further than what's going on in the Cider House Rules, because it makes it the center of the romantic comedy, right? The romantic comedy are all these tensions between the boy and the girl. They look like they're not going to be together, and then something happens and they're together. Something brings them together. That's how romantic comedies end happily for the romantic couple. Well, the thing that brings the couple together here is the act of having an abortion. So it's at the center of the romantic comedy. I'm going to come back to that at the very end. So let's back up. I jumped ahead to 2014 from 1999. 1999 Cider House Rules, 2014 Obvious Child. Something's really gone wrong by 2014 in the culture when not only does a film like Obvious Child get made, but it receives almost universal critical acclaim from movie critics. Let's go back a little bit earlier to 2007. 2007 was known in some circles as the year of the pro-life film. Bella, Waitress, Knocked Up, Juno. Varying levels of quality in those films, varying degrees of something like commitment to a pro-life view. Some people thought that there might be a trend here, and we have seen other significantly successful pro-life movies, Gosnell, Unplanned, most recently. But there's a really interesting scene. I want to play a scene from Juno, and then we're going to compare that to a scene from Grey's Anatomy. So let's cue the Juno scene. She's headed to the abortion clinic at this point.
Well, it's good seeing you, Soo-Chin.
Your baby probably has a beating heart, you know. It can feel pain. And it has fingernails.
Fingernails? Really?
It's actually a great scene. It's a really good scene. I think it's just the oddity of thinking about human fingernails, right? That triggers something in here that says, that's weird. Yeah, it's weird. But it's weird in a way that indicates there's a human person there, right? And then she goes in and she's suddenly haunted by everyone's fingernails in the entire, and gets up and leaves, right? So what Juno allows into the conversation that Cider House doesn't, and that Obvious Child doesn't, is the question of the humanity of the fetus, right? It allows it in. Now I want to play the, this is in a way the most emotionally wrenching scene from Grey's Anatomy. You have two of the main characters, Christina and Owen, and she's letting him know that she's pregnant and has no plans to keep the baby. And compare that, the way the question of the humanity comes up in this scene with what just happened in Juno. So let's watch this.
I need to talk to you.
You know, I think I'm gonna order pizza. If you want, I can get...
I'm pregnant.
Christina.
I cannot believe this is happening.
I know. I know it's complicated. I know it wasn't supposed to happen like this, but... Christina, this could be something.
What? No. There's no way we're doing this. Do you hear me?
Christina.
No, I am not this beautiful vessel for all that might be good about the future. I'm not hearing your hopes and dreams, no.
But I get to talk. I'm here. There's two of us. We are a partnership. Can we just think together? Is that okay? I know who you are. I know what you want. I love you. I don't love the incubating potential of your womb. I love you. Why would I want to do something that would make you miserable? You think I love you more when you're miserable? You think I want that? You running off to Meredith? You think I'm looking for more of that? But I think there's a way.
No!
I still get to talk. There is a way to make this work without it ruining your life or derailing your career.
I don't want a baby.
Well, you have one.
Are you getting all lifey on me?
How late are you?
That does not matter.
Of course it matters.
Okay, fine. You tell me when life begins. I can't wait to hear this one.
I don't know. Does it have hands?
I cannot believe you are doing this.
I'm just asking a question.
I don't want one. I don't hate children. I respect children. I think they should have parents who want them.
I want them. I want them, and maybe you could too. I believe your life can be bigger than you think it is. I know you can contain more than you think you can. I'm not saying we do this. I'm just saying let's think. Let's see what kind of life we can imagine. Christina, yeah. I imagine such a huge life for us.
It's a really powerful scene, I think, in part because it involves a pretty mature, at some level, relationship between the two, and the emotional investment in one another is at a high level, but this decision is going to have an impact upon how they see one another and whether they even stay together. But you notice in the middle of that, when she says, I don't want a baby, and he says, I'm sorry, you have one. Right? And then he starts to ask about how far along she is, does it have hands? And she says at one point, are you getting all lifey on me? Right? As if she's going to put up resistance to that question even being raised, right? The question of the status, the personhood of the fetus. I'm going to move to one final clip in a moment, but in popular culture, this is what I mean about the way in which even seemingly innocuous and merely entertaining TV shows and films have implicit moral messages, right? And in fact, the better the drama, typically the more implicit and indirect is the moral message, right? But we need to become articulate about film and television and the things that we're watching. We need to have a vocabulary to say what we like in it, what's good, what's bad. There's sort of two extremes in thinking about popular culture. One is it's all corrupt, just avoid it completely. And then on the other side, there's a kind of mindless taking of it all in, right? Just considering it to be mere entertainment. I think we have a responsibility to avoid those two, right? There are certainly things that are toxic in the popular culture that we should avoid, and especially that children should avoid. The big problem in our popular culture in film and TV is not so much, especially with violence, that people will see violent images and then go out and imitate them, although seeing violent images day after day after day can have a corrosive effect on the soul. The big problem with most of our popular culture for young people, people your age and going younger, and now younger and younger, because young people can access almost anything if they have a smartphone or a computer in front of them that's connected to the internet. The big problem is the danger of the erosion of the moral imagination. Right? Young people now increasingly grow up in communities where they don't have the formation often of families or churches or schools. The worst part of Hollywood is happy to march into those kids' soul and set up shop and own their souls. But how do they own their souls? They own their souls through owning their imagination, right? By the images that they're attracted to, by the images that form their vision of what's possible for human life, what constitutes success, what constitutes failure, whether there's any such thing as hope or sacrifice or virtue, right? One of the nice things, as horrifying as it is about the Grey's Anatomy scene, is the question of whether you can be more, right, toward the end than what you are, whether your life can contain more. And I think we have to realize that for a lot of the people we're engaging with on the abortion issue, their assumption is that most lives can't contain more. Right? And so we're not just arguing against a position, we're arguing against unstated assumptions that have been formed in people by how our culture works, and especially by a kind of despair and a sense that I can't be expanded or I won't be in terms of my moral sensibility and how I respond to others, particularly how I respond to the innocent. The other thing that's going on, particularly in romantic comedies, and these can be romantic comedies that are completely innocent and fine to watch. How many romantic comedies have you watched where when the male and the female get together at the end, there's some insight that's bringing them together that has to do with, this is the person I'd like to have children with? How many romantic comedies? Think about this as you're watching romantic comedies. I would say almost none. Right? It's always that they just like being together or realize at some level that they need one another. Right? They've been humbled by the trials and tribulations of the romantic comedy. They end up coming together. I would say that one of the subtle things that's going on, even in those seemingly harmless romantic comedies, is retraining our natural instincts so that part that is quite natural, I think, of falling in love, the part that says, I'm in love with this person, and maybe I never thought of it before, this means I'd really like to have kids with this person. That what's going on in these stories is an attempt to train that instinct out of our souls. So I want to end with a clip that I think is in our popular culture from Lord of the Rings, the great counter to that assumption. So this is the story of Arwen and Aragorn, and this is in the Peter Jackson film. Now, this is developed not in Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, but in the appendices, right? And Arwen can go to the Undying Lands, the Grey Havens, and be an immortal and live very happily. She happens to also love Aragorn. Her father tells her, Elrond, there is nothing here for you but death. So she heads off to the Undying Lands and then sees a vision. And I'll tell you what's interesting about this after we show it. Go ahead and play this clip, please.
Take her by the safest road. A ship lies anchored in the Grey Havens. It waits to carry her across the sea. The last journey of Arwen Undomir.
Lady Arwen, we cannot delay. My lady!
Tell me what you have seen.
Arwen.
You have the gift of foresight. What did you see?
I looked into your future and I saw death.
There is also life. You saw there was a child. You saw my son.
That future is almost gone.
But it is not lost.
Nothing is certain.
Some things are certain. If I leave him now, I will regret it forever. It is time.
Really beautiful scene in every respect. And notice here that the regret goes in a different way from the way it went in some of the other clips that we watched, right? The regret here will be missing out on the chance to have children with the person you love. Right? It's a really beautiful, the interesting thing about this is that storyline, that explanation of the motive, because both in the book and in the film, Arwen decides to be with Aragorn. In the book, there's no child mentioned. So the filmmakers, when Peter Jackson was making this, he had two assistants who were women who said, there's not enough motivation here for her to give up this perfectly happy life. Right? And so they came up with the plot line and added it to the Tolkien story of the motivation of her seeing a vision of having a child. Right? And that's actually the motivation for her remaining with Aragorn in this case. That's a brilliant counter to all of the romantic comedy movies that have been out, right? It operates in exactly the opposite direction from those. And I would say it's much truer to our natural instincts if they haven't been reformed or altered by the way our popular culture wants us to think about love, marriage, and children. Thank you. Okay, a few questions.
All right, we've got the questions back here from submitted through the app. Our first question is, do you think the media desensitizes abortion, and how can we change this?
Yes, I mean, one of the ways to think about this is, and I'll give an example right after I say this, but we have a film and television culture where over the last 30 years in particular, going back even further, but particularly over the last 30 years, there is an openness to the depiction of explicit graphic violence. Right? Actually, there's been a pullback in some circles on the explicit depiction of sexuality. But the depiction of raw, graphic, horrifying violence continues in our culture. And it's there in certain genres of film. It's there in very graphic depictions of sort of medical-based investigative TV shows, right? Where you have the physical graphic depiction of wounds and how they enter the body and so forth. And yet, if there's an image anywhere of an aborted fetus, our mainstream media and culture goes crazy about how offensive that is. Right? This is not so much desensitizing as it is not allowing for degrees of sensitization to the reality of abortion, right? Certainly that trend that I talked about at the outset of moving from safe, legal, and rare to shout your abortion. Shout your abortion is about as desensitized as you can possibly be to the reality of abortion. And as I've tried to show, in fact, what's going on beneath the surface is simply a rejection, a refusal of any discussion of the personhood of the fetus, right? So it's desensitizing us not just to abortion, but to the question about abortion. Because it doesn't want the question is ruled out. It's not an appropriate question. Civilized people don't bring those things up, or it's laughed at, as it is in something like Obvious Child, right? So there's a really interesting, it's kind of a brutal film. It's also a big critique of socialism. 4 months, 3 weeks, 2 days, and I think you have a review that I wrote of that, where there's a woman trying to get an abortion and she has a very difficult time getting it. And this is on one level supposed to be a critique of the oppressive socialist regime, that it doesn't have liberal abortion laws or safe clinics. But at the very end of this film, which is a harrowing film, there is a brief image of the aborted fetus. And the girlfriend, the friend of the girl who's had the abortion, no longer talks about discarding it, but about burying it. And I know pro-choice film critics who said that was the strongest pro-life film I ever saw, simply because of those 30 seconds where you didn't expect to see the result of the abortion, and you do, and then you see the different way in which people are talking about that. Bury it, not discard it, right? So being aware of the various things that are working in our culture to desensitize us about abortion and to rule out of bounds certain kinds of questions and considerations, that's initially how we respond, and then appreciating alternative depictions. I would also say, and I'm not going to blow the plot for you, but the science fiction film Arrival has a really sophisticated, subtle pro-life argument that's akin to what's going on in Arwen. And I think we need to be attuned to the surprising ways in which sometimes Hollywood gets it right and doesn't even know that it got it right. And if they thought that that was an implication, they might have redone the film, right? We have to be alert to those kinds of things and say, look, if you're drawn to this, what's appealing to you? What's moving your imagination and your heart?
Do you have a story for why you're pro-life?
So I don't really. I mean, I don't have a kind of conversion story. I was born and raised Catholic, didn't take my faith all that seriously until I went to a small all-boys Catholic high school, DeMatha High School right outside of Washington, D.C. First generation to go to college in either side of my family. Went to the University of Maryland, which is 40,000, and still is, but back then was quite secular. I had 3 atheist teachers my first semester, and they were not evil people who were trying to destroy people's faith. They found it sort of amusing that I was brought up Catholic. And one of them I remain friends with to this day. But it shook me. It made me start to wonder why I believed what I believed about the existence of God, about all of the key moral issues. And this would have been in 1978, so not long much closer to Roe versus Wade than your births. So this debate was very much in the air. John Paul II was Pope and starting to write encyclicals that were very much on these issues of the culture of death, although that encyclical would not come out for a number of years later. Once I started to realize that I believed there was a God and that I wanted to live out my faith more fully, then the moral issues came along with that. Seems to me this is of a piece, although you certainly do not have to be a Catholic or a Christian or even a believer to acknowledge the reality of life in the womb, we've got an advantage if we are, right? So we start from certain kinds of assumptions about human persons made in the image and likeness of God being knit together in our mother's womb. And so there's no big conversion for me, but an awakening to what that meant when I was in college.
How would Aquinas respond to a culture that has now almost completely adopted the postmodern rejection of truth? Is classical argument even possible?
So it depends who you're talking with. I don't think that many people get argued into anything. Now, that doesn't mean that argument is unimportant. It's important to know the arguments, and it's important to know the arguments of people you disagree with better than they understand their arguments themselves. This is a universal problem in our culture now, that people are cutting off conversation with anyone who holds a conclusion that's different from their own, right? This is the silencing culture that's going on college campuses. When you have a speaker who shows up that a certain element in the student body doesn't want to hear, shout them down. This is the last place where that ought to be happening, is on college campuses, which ought to be about open debate and rigorous argument. So it doesn't mean that argument is unimportant, and being willing to take arguments seriously, patiently, sympathetically, listening, rethinking your own position and then responding, I think is really important. But one of the reasons I like to look at film and art is that good film and good art works on us indirectly, right? Good art, it's like if you watch the Matrix films, the first Matrix is really good. And it's actually philosophically quite interesting. The filmmakers read all these clips about what brilliant philosophers they were, and then they made 2 and 3, and it's got these really long, boring sections where they're arguing philosophy. Arguing philosophy in a film is not good. It's not good. It's not the way a film works. Argue philosophy in philosophy. If you're going to be a filmmaker, tell a brilliant, beautiful story that people can't turn away from. And in that, indirectly show, as Tolkien did, as Peter Jackson did. I don't know whether Peter Jackson's pro-life, I rather doubt it, but he's telling the story authentically in a way that works on your imagination and leads you into something deeper. It leads you into what the character in Grey's Anatomy thinks she's incapable of, which is a bigger conception of her life, right? Where the parts that she's committed to, some of them she may have to give up, others of them are certainly going to have to be reassembled in terms of some larger view of herself. That's what art does, right? It works on the imagination to draw us out sympathetically into something where we see more deeply, right? Where our imagination, the sense of our own and other human possibilities, is enriched rather than diminished.
Do you have any thoughts on how abortion is portrayed in other forms of media, such as music or modern art?
No. Not anything that I've worked out yet. Sorry. Next year. That'll be my assignment. I'll work on that. I really like to think these things through, and I've done it mainly just in terms of film and television, and I haven't thought that much about other artistic media.
With greater exposure of abortion in the media, do you think parents should introduce the topic of abortion to their young children?
Wow. Well, I mean, this has got to be family by family, kid by kid, right? These sorts of judgments. As I say, there is a lot of toxic stuff in the culture, and certain things that a teenager or a young adult can handle, younger kids can't. I remember I don't remember exactly the name of the horror film. I used to review films for National Review Online like 2 or 3 times a month, and I remember doing a double header of horror films one afternoon to review these two, and it was the last sort of mainstream set of horror films. I think I walked out of the second one, that I just gave up on it. And there's certain elements in horror films that can be really intellectually interesting and take the problem of evil seriously. When horror films become just about what I was talking about earlier, the increasingly graphic display of physical violence, it's just a dead end. I ended up writing a review not about the film that I saw, but about the fact that 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a young couple with a 8-month-old kid in the theater. And that was more frightening to me than what I was seeing on the screen. And it isn't that the child probably registered consciously everything that was going on, but just the sounds and the images, right? The ghastliness of it, and that parents who maybe couldn't find a babysitter, maybe didn't want to pay a babysitter, wanted to go see this film. Well, there's something wrong in a culture there about people, well, this is, they won't know what's going on. This is just harmless. So the age at which young people get it, now people hear about things, right? If you're just around or if you're looking at a computer or something. So sometimes parents I think have to address these questions before they would rather do it. And then it's a matter of practical wisdom to decide how much you tell a child at what point, right, about these things. I think it is important, and we learned this from Harry Potter when nobody wants to say the name of Voldemort, he who shall not be named. One of the great themes in Harry Potter is you've got to be willing to say evil when you see it, right? And so I don't think we should shrink away from naming the evil. The question of how we do that is a more complicated one, and all of us know, you all growing up, siblings, those of us who are older, kids, different kids even in the same family can handle different things at different times.
Do you believe that the open discussion of sex and sexual relations has normalized sex and therefore normalizing reproduction and unborn babies?
So a couple things about this. One is that, and this goes back to something I was trying to say about romantic comedies that I can broaden. We've flattened out what love means. We've flattened out human desire. The problem today is not that desires are too strong, it's that desires are too weak. Right? So we have reduced sexual desire to the mere satisfaction of a biological impulse. So we've separated it out from being connected to the great and deepest mysteries of human life. Right? Which are mysterious and wondrous and also terrifying. So this has been an ongoing project in our culture to try and remove from our desires the deep, horrifying, wondrous mysteries that our desires point to. So if you flatten out human desire and you make the desire for sexual pleasure like any other consumer desire, then we're not talking about the same thing anymore. Right? The second thing is that we are so addicted in our culture to technology, and this is an important point about technology. There's all kinds of stuff about how mentally distracted we are because we're always on My Precious here, the thing that we love and hate, like Gollum love and hates the ring. And we can't, so that we're distracted by it, that our mental capacity. But what we're not talking about there is there's something magical about this stuff, right? Tolkien, when he's writing about technology and magic, says they're about the same thing. Technology and magic are about reducing to the vanishing point the gap between I want it and it appears. Right? So as soon as I'm done, people will flip on the lights. Hey, give us some light. It appears. Right? If you're in a Harry Potter novel, you pull out your wand and say lumos, and the light appears. Same thing. Right? Well, we are in awe of the magic of technology, so that the addiction is not just fear of missing out. The addiction at some level is that this is my precious. This is something that shows me things and enables me to do things. What happens with technology, though, is that we are increasingly detached from what's natural. And we're increasingly detached from what's natural in our own bodies, right? It's a very weird thing to say, I own my body, it's my property, and I can do with it what I want. That's a very weird thing to say. We say it naturally. It's not a natural thought at all. No one really had it until like the 17th century, right? And the people who had it wanted to separate us from what our natural bodily impulses were telling us, right? So that we would have control over our bodies the way technology gives us control over external nature. If we think of our bodies in this way, if we think of our sexuality in this way, then I don't really learn anything from my body and my desire, right? I mean, one of the things I can learn is that my desires are disordered, but that bothers me because there are deep, sacred mysteries about my body and my desires, right? Not just because I can get it wrong, like failing to use a turn signal or running a red light, which is even more dangerous, right? What's wrong about disordered desire is that I might no longer learn how to read the signs that are pointing me to in my desire. What Arwen feels when she sees the possibility of a child coming from her love for Aragorn. That's not coming out of something that she thought about. It's coming out of just seeing it and her heart immediately and her desire immediately affirming it, right? That's the big problem about sexuality in our culture. We're not even talking about what other people in previous generations called sex. We've created something different.
Do you have any recommendations for good pro-life directors, movies, or showrunners?
So, I mean, I've mentioned a couple things already, right? So we know that there are movies that, I mentioned the Year of the Pro-Life movie, at least Bella is the only one in that group that I mentioned that was intentionally sort of pro-life. And then we've seen more recent pro-life movies. And these are almost never, they're always salutary. There's always something good in them. What we need are movies that have pro-life messages in them that are profound and deep and surprise us with the pro-life message, right? Most pro-life movies are preaching to us, right? And maybe there's some people on the edge that they bring in. Just like a Cider House Rules, although that's a little more sophisticated, but Cider House is also preaching to its own choir, right? So the question is, can we make art the way believers once made art that is great and no one can look away from it because of the greatness of the art? Right? That's the real long-term task for our churches and artists. Between now and then, I think it's really interesting to find films like Arrival where you say, whoa, what just happened there? Right? About this mom and her child that she knows something about in advance. What's implicit in that? And this is a film that was universally praised, right? Well, in it, I think is a pretty subtle pro-life message. I don't know that that's a pro-life director, probably not, right? My money would be against it if I were betting. But I find those sort of moments in the culture really interesting and worth taking note of.
Do you have any words of advice to someone entering creative/entertainment careers on how to best reframe the cultural conversation on abortion and pro-life issues?
So become a great artist. Pray, deepen your faith, and become the best artist you can become. We can't give God second best. Not just in terms of our intentions, right? Our intentions have got to be good, and we constantly have to pray for the purification of our intentions. But in whatever work we do, we need to master the craft. We need to try to be the best at that craft, right? The better we are at the craft, particularly for artists, the more compelling. I mean, we see the world from a certain perspective, right? And that includes a pro-life view of the world. It's built into the way we think, the way we talk, the way we imagine the world. So artists are going to see the world in that way. Every artist sees the world from a certain perspective. If you combine that with the capacity to make great art, you're going to give God a better gift, and you're going to reach more people. You're going to reach more people by drawing them in through the beautiful. It's a lot easier today to go back to the issue about argument and truth. It's a lot easier as a first step. You have these, what were called, philosophers I read, like Aquinas in the Middle Ages, the transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty, right? It's a lot harder today to go directly through truth or even to go directly through goodness unless the truth and the goodness are presented as beautiful. Right? The instinct we have when we're watching that Lord of the Rings scene at the end is to get caught up in the imagery, the music, the emotion, the depth of it. Right? So you're moved by the beauty in there before it even registers in your head what this is saying about what's true or false about human life, what's good or bad in human life. Right? So the more beautiful we can make things in our art, the more compelling is going to be the message.
Do you have any thoughts on The Handmaid's Tale?
I haven't watched it all the way through. I've only watched, but it's clearly a more sophisticated version of something like the Da Vinci Code, which wants to sort of reverse our imagery and our symbols and make, as if the real threat to our culture is somehow a theological takeover of our political order. I find it hard to take, and that, is dramatically well done in lots of ways, but I find it hard to take that assumption seriously. It seems much more likely that we're going to be ruled by progressive technocrats who will not allow us to talk about certain things, including especially this topic.
What do you think will be the trend of our culture in the future in regards to this topic?
This is really hard to predict. Who would have thought that when Roe v. Wade, when the decision was delivered, that we'd be this many years later and we would still have this level of opposition in the culture and division over this? And who would have thought that actually the pro-life side would be showing pretty interesting gains, especially among young people? Not any of the advocates of abortion, I can tell you that. Right? So it's really hard to tell. The arc of history, as Martin Luther King said, and others have said before and after him, may bend toward justice. I think you can only believe that if you believe in a God that's actually orchestrating history in a providential way. I don't know why you would think that otherwise. But from moment to moment, it's really hard to tell what's going on and what's going to happen in the next election and what's going to happen in our culture. We've seen in Europe divisions emerge in the last 3 to 5 years that no one saw coming, right? And certainly no one on the pro-choice, pro-abortion side in the early 70s could have seen our day and thought that this would be anything like the March for Life would still be going on with a number of people going each year, that events like this would be attracting young college students from all sorts of mainstream colleges across the country. Nobody could have seen that. So it is, and if it's an argument, it's a winning argument, right? Which is why what you see in the popular culture is an attempt, as I tried to point out with some of the clips, to do away with argument, right? And that's dangerous, particularly in a democracy, because there are elements of tyranny in that, right? There are elements of the things that Orwell saw, right? Where you simply can't talk about things, or you have to rename things in a way that blocks from view what's actually true about the things. That's why proper naming is really important. And art can help us to name things, right? Because art can help us to see things again in a way that says, oh, that's what that is. Right? We're moved to see it through our emotions and through our imagination. We're not argued into it, but if we're reflective, what we'll say is, oh, this poem, this musical piece, this story, this movie actually helps me to name something that I couldn't have named well before.
All right, this is our last question.
That was a long list of questions.
What is your favorite pro-life movie and why?
Well, I mean, I think that, of the ones that are known as pro-life, I like Bella. I think it's a really compelling story. But the two that I mentioned, which are not thought of as pro-life, 4 months, 3 weeks, 2 days, and Arrival, are my two favorite precisely for the reasons I've already mentioned, which is that they surprise you. Good art surprises you, right? It's why we love, unless they're too hackneyed, we love surprised endings, or we love plot twists, which take us down paths. Art that works well on us, that keeps us captivated, is surprising us. And so we need to make art that is more, a lot of art is very good, and it's fine, it's important. But the art that's really going to turn things is art that will surprise people. Thank you.